The insistent ringing pierced through the polite applause of the design conference, and a glance at my phone screen showed Maria, next door. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Maria only ever called if a package was delivered or, once, when a stray dog had decided my porch was its new home. This felt different. I ducked out of the ballroom, the San Francisco fog clinging to the windows of the convention center, a stark contrast to the usually sunny disposition of my Portland neighborhood. Sarah, thank God. Maria's voice was rushed, crackly. There are movers at your house. Big truck. They're clearing everything out. The world tilted. Movers Maria. There must be some mistake. I'm in San Francisco for another 3 days. I didn't schedule any movers. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Loud enough, I thought, to echo in the cavernous hallway. Dishes didn't crash. No voices were shouting in my ear, but the buzzing of my phone felt like an electric shock, and the image of strangers in my home, my sanctuary, made me want to scream. Instead, a cold dread froze my vocal cords. No mistake. "Honey," she said, her voice laced with genuine concern. "I asked them. Said you were out of town." They just shrugged, said they had a work order. Looked official. Your dad was here earlier, with a woman, younger, blonde. Your sister Chloe. My blood ran cold, then boiled. I mumbled a thank you to Maria, promising to call her back, and my fingers, slick with a sudden sweat, fumbled as I dialed my parents' number. It rang 3 times, each chime an eternity, before my mother answered, her voice infuriatingly calm. "Hi, dear." "How's the conference, Mom?" "What's going on at my house?" Maria called. "Said there are movers." A slight pause, not a guilty pause. More like a deliberate one. "Oh, that. Yes. We decided it was for the best." Sarah. "Decided what was for the best. My house isn't for sale?" "I live there." My voice was rising, a tremor starting in my hands. "Well, not anymore." My father's voice boomed, suddenly on the line, likely on speakerphone. "We sold it. Chloe's wedding is in 2 months, and Bradley's parents expect a certain standard. We needed to access the equity. I'm Sarah. I'm 34 years old. And that little bungalow in Portland wasn't just wooden nails and a roof over my head. It was every late night I'd spent hunched over my laptop building my freelance graphic design business from scratch. Every freelance gig I'd taken on the side while working a soul-crushing day job in my 20s. Every takeout meal I'd eaten instead of dining out. Every vacation I'd postponed. It was the physical manifestation of a decade of quiet hustle, of independence painstakingly carved out. It was mine. Or so I thought. The shock was a physical blow, leaving me breathless. All those years, all that work, erased by a decision I wasn't even consulted on. You sold my home I finally managed, the words catching in my throat. Without my permission. My things are in there. My life is in there. Don't be dramatic, Sarah, my mother said, her tone dismissive. They're your things. We'll put them in storage. You're doing so well with your little business. You can always buy another place. Chloe needs this. This is for family. Family. The word felt like ash in my mouth. I remembered a fleeting, odd conversation with Chloe last week. She'd called, unusually bubbly, asking very specific questions about my trip to San Francisco, when I was leaving, exactly when I'd be back, if I'd be checking emails much. At the time, I'd brushed it off as her usual self-absorbed chatter. Now, it felt like a cold, calculated reconnaissance. And that missed call a few days ago, from a local Portland realtor I didn't know. It flashed in my mind like a warning siren I'd tragically ignored. My stomach churned with a nauseous mix of fury and despair. I ended the call without another word, the sterile silence of the convention center hallway pressing in on me. The betrayal was a gaping wound, raw and bleeding. The initial numbness that had frozen me in that San Francisco hallway began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning rage. My mind raced, replaying years of slights, of blatant favoritism. But this was a new stratosphere of cruelty. I remembered Christmases where Chloe's gifts dwarfed mine, birthdays where my achievements were footnotes to her latest social triumph. I recalled the time I'd lent my parents $5,000 when their antique shop was struggling, a significant sum for me back then. Money I never saw again, but which they'd seemingly forgotten when Chloe needed a new car a year later. It wasn't even about the money. It was about the casual disregard, the assumption that Sarah, the responsible one, the quiet one, would just absorb it, that I would understand. Flashback to 7 years ago, I was 27, finally ready to buy my first home. My freelance business was stable but not yet booming, and my credit, while good, wasn't stellar enough for the best mortgage rates on my own. My parents had offered to co-sign. "It's just a signature." "Honey," my father had said, beaming, "to help you get started. Of course, you'll be making all the payments." And I had. Every single mortgage payment, every property tax bill, every HOA fee, every leaky faucet and overgrown shrub. It was my name on the utility bills, my sweat equity in the garden, my design aesthetic in every paint choice. The bungalow was mine in every way that mattered, or so I'd believed. Their names on the deed were supposed to be a formality, a stepping stone. Now, it was the lever they'd used to pry my life apart, but even in my pain, a spark of defiance flickered. I wasn't the timid girl anymore who just swallowed disappointment. I had built a business, navigated difficult clients, stood my ground in negotiations. They might think I'd just cry and move on, but they were about to learn otherwise. I wouldn't let them win. Not this time. I immediately called David Chin, an old college friend who'd become a sharp, no-nonsense attorney in Portland. He'd handled the initial purchase of the bungalow for me. His voice, usually brisk and professional, softened with concern as I recounted the story, my own voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. "Sarah, this is astounding," he said, a rare note of shock in his tone. "Co-signing gives them certain rights, yes, but to sell it out from under you without your consent, especially when you're the sole contributor to all costs, that's egregious. Send me everything you have, the purchase agreement, any correspondence. Let me look at the deed records again." As I gathered the digital files, my heart hammered. What if they could legally do this? What if my understanding of co-ownership was fatally flawed? The thought was terrifying. But then I remembered David's meticulous nature. He was the kind of lawyer who read every line of fine print twice. While I waited for David to call back, my mind replayed Chloe's recent social media posts. Extravagant engagement photos, talk of a Vera Wang gown, a 5-star honeymoon in Bora Bora. Bradley, her fiancé, was a software developer who talked a big game, always flashing new gadgets and designer labels. My parents were clearly dazzled by him, by the perceived status he would bring to the family through Chloe. Their desperation to fund this fairy tale wedding, it seemed, knew no bounds. They were so blinded by the sparkle, so eager to please Chloe and her new beau, that they'd become sloppy, arrogant even, in their assumptions about my reaction. They thought their justification, "it's for family," was a shield against any consequence. Later that afternoon, David called back. His voice was different. Taut. "Sarah," he began, "I've reviewed the county records and the copy of the deed you sent. Your parents didn't just list the house with your names on it, counting on your eventual agreement or some kind of legal loophole to force a sale with a co-owner." He paused, and I could hear him take a deep breath. They initiated a sale.
And to do that quickly, without you present, they needed your signature on several preliminary documents and disclosures that the realtor would have required. Sarah. The records show a Sarah Marie Thompson signed those documents electronically 2 days ago. My blood turned to ice. David, what are you saying I'm saying? He continued, his voice grim. That unless you were secretly in Portland 2 days ago and signed those documents with a notary who then backdated them, or you gave them explicit power of attorney to sign on your behalf for this specific transaction, which I highly doubt, it appears your signature was forged. Forged. The word hung in the air, heavy and vile. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust, a callous disregard for my life and property. This was criminal. The missed call from the unknown realtor suddenly clicked into sharper focus. They were likely calling to do a verbal verification of my intent to sell. A standard procedure, and when they couldn't reach me, my parents must have panicked and pushed through with a forged signature to keep the process moving. The sheer audacity, the criminality of it, was a gut punch that left me reeling. It was a bigger, uglier betrayal than I could have imagined. My fight wasn't just about getting my house back or compensation. It was about a fundamental violation that crossed a very dangerous line. This changed everything. My resolve hardened from a spark into a raging fire. The revelation of the forgery was a twisted key, unlocking a new level of cold fury within me. This wasn't just about parental favoritism gone wild. This was a calculated criminal act. My parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, had willingly committed fraud. For a wedding. For Chloe. My first instinct was to fly to Portland, to confront them, to see the deceit in their eyes. But David's calm, strategic counsel prevailed. No. Sarah. Not yet. We need to be smart about this. Your emotional distress is understandable, and it will be a component of any civil suit. But right now, we need to act with precision. His words, civil suit, and the unspoken implication of criminal charges echoed in my mind. It was a dizzying escalation. So, what's our move? I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. I was no longer just the wronged daughter. I was a victim of a serious offense, and I needed to think like one. I'm drafting a formal package right now, David explained. It will include a cease and desist letter to the realty company handling the sale, informing them of the fraudulent signature and the potential invalidity of their listing agreement. Copies will go to the managing broker and their legal department. Simultaneously, I'll draft a letter of demand to your parents. It will lay out the facts as we know them, the unauthorized attempt to sell your property, the forged signature, and the potential legal ramifications they face, including charges of fraud and forgery, which carry severe penalties. Sarah, we're talking felonies. Felonies. The word was a chilling reminder of how far they'd gone. The demand letter, David continued, will give them a stark choice. Either they immediately halt any sale proceedings, ensure the property title remains unequivocally clear of any new encumbrances, and enter into negotiations for a settlement with you that includes full restitution for any financial damages, legal fees, and significant compensation for emotional distress and the flagrant breach of trust. Or we proceed with filing a formal criminal complaint with the Portland Police Department and initiate a civil lawsuit for damages that will publicly expose their actions. He paused, letting the weight of it sink in. We'll give them 48 hours to respond affirmatively to the demand for immediate cessation of sale activities and to agree to mediation for the settlement. My big move wasn't going to be a tearful confrontation. It was going to be a legally airtight maneuver that would hit them where they were most vulnerable: their reputation, their finances, and their freedom. I pictured their faces as they read that letter. The dawning realization that their little Sarah wasn't going to just roll over and accept their egregious behavior. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. As David worked, I replayed memories, searching for more clues,
for some sign that they were capable of this. There was the time my father had borrowed a valuable antique from their shop's consignment client for a weekend display at a local historical society event without the client's explicit permission, returning it just in the nick of time. He'd called it initiative. My mother had a way of subtly rewriting history to suit her narrative, conveniently forgetting promises made or glossing over uncomfortable truths. These weren't criminal acts, but they were small erosions of integrity, hints of a willingness to bend rules when it suited them. Their fatal flaw, perhaps, was underestimating me and overestimating their ability to control every outcome. News of their actions, or rather David's impending actions, would surely send ripples through their social circle. My parents cared deeply about appearances, about their standing in their community of fellow small business owners and church acquaintances. The thought of a public scandal, of being labeled as frauds, would be their worst nightmare. Chloe's perfect wedding, the one they were sacrificing my home for, would be irrevocably tainted. The 48-hour deadline David set felt like an eternity. I paced my sterile San Francisco hotel room, a stark contrast to the warm, vibrant colors of my Portland bungalow. I imagined the scene when the courier delivered David's package. The confusion, then the dawning horror. Would they call me, screaming, begging, blaming? The call came 24 hours later, not from my parents, but from a number I didn't recognize. It was Chloe. Her voice was a choked sob, barely coherent. "Sarah, you can't do this. You'll ruin everything. Mom and Dad, they're a mess. They're a mess," I replied, my voice devoid of sympathy. "Chloe, they forged my signature. They tried to steal my home. What did you expect?" But it's for the wedding," she wailed, as if that excused everything. "Bradley, his family, they expect." Then came the second surprise, tumbling out amidst her tears and panicked explanations. "Bradley doesn't have as much money as he says." "Sarah, he's been pressuring us. He said if the wedding wasn't up to his family's standards, they'd look down on us, on me. He said we needed to contribute more, to show we were invested. Mom and Dad were just trying to help me. He's the one who kept saying there must be a way to get money from your house quickly." My mind reeled. Bradley, the flashy tech entrepreneur, was a fraud himself, or at least not the financial heavyweight he portrayed. And Chloe, was she merely entitled, or was she also a victim, caught in a web of her fiancé's making? Too scared or too naive to see it, the odd conversation where she'd grilled me about my travel dates took on a new, more sinister light. Was she fishing for information for Bradley? So he could pinpoint when I'd be vulnerable, Chloe continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He's not always nice. Sarah. He gets angry if I question him about money. He said my parents were smart to figure out a way with your house. This new information didn't excuse my parents' actions, not by a long shot. Forgery was forgery. Betrayal was betrayal. But it added a layer of complexity, a desperate, misguided attempt to secure what they thought was their daughter's happiness and security, egged on by a manipulative fiancé. My parents weren't just villains in this story. They were also fools, easily played. And Chloe, for all her perceived entitlements, might be walking into a disaster. A new, unexpected feeling surfaced amidst my anger, a sliver of pity for Chloe, and a renewed determination that Bradley wouldn't get away with manipulating everyone. My fight suddenly wasn't just about my house. It was about exposing a wider net of deceit. The stakes had just gotten higher, and my next move needed to be even more calculated. I had a new target in my sights, and my parents were, in a twisted way, about to become a secondary concern to the man who had helped orchestrate their downfall. The revelation about Bradley recast the entire situation. My parents were still guilty, their actions inexcusable, but their motivations, however warped, stemmed from a desperate desire to see Chloe secure. It was Bradley who seemed to be the puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows, preying on their insecurities and Chloe's naivety. David and I discussed this new development. This changes the dynamic. Sarah, but not the core issue of your parents' fraud, he advised. However, it does give us additional leverage, and it might influence how you want to ultimately resolve this beyond just financial compensation. My anger towards my parents was still a raw, aching wound, but now it was complicated by a strange, protective feeling towards Chloe, despite everything. If Bradley was as manipulative and potentially abusive as Chloe's tearful confession hinted, then her fairy tale wedding was a gilded cage. The 48-hour deadline for my parents to respond to David's demand letter was nearing its end. The silence from their end was deafening. Then, with only a few hours to spare, David received a call. It wasn't from my parents, but from a lawyer representing them. He was an older local attorney, clearly flustered and out of his depth dealing with potential felony charges for his clients. Mr. Chen, he'd stammered to David. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. They understand the gravity of the situation. They are prepared to do whatever is necessary to rectify this unfortunate misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, David had repeated, his voice like ice. Mr. Peterson, forgery and attempted grand larceny are not misunderstandings. They are felonies. Is your client's position that they will immediately halt the sale, clear any and all encumbrances they've placed on Ms. Thompson's property, and agree to mediation for full restitution and damages, or am I to proceed with filing a criminal complaint tomorrow morning? The capitulation was swift. Within the hour, David had a signed agreement faxed from Mr. Peterson, confirming the immediate termination of any sale agreement regarding my bungalow. They also agreed to mediation to determine the financial settlement. The first part of my victory was secured. The realtor, upon receiving David's initial cease and desist and learning of the forgery, had already backed away, wanting no part of a fraudulent transaction. The mediation was scheduled for the following week, back in Portland. I flew in, not to the welcoming embrace of my own home, but to a sterile hotel room, a grim echo of my San Francisco experience. My bungalow, thankfully, was still mine, untouched by movers beyond perhaps an initial predatory assessment. The locks had been changed on David's advice as soon as the agreement was signed. Seeing my parents at the mediator's office was jarring. They looked diminished. My father, usually so blustery and confident, was pale and seemed to have shrunk. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, and she avoided my gaze. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by a heavy air of shame and fear. Chloe was not present. The mediation itself was less a negotiation and more a dictation of terms. David was relentless, outlining the costs I'd incurred, the severe emotional distress, the damage to the familial relationship. A point my parents' lawyer actually tried to argue showed my lack of familial feeling, until David coolly reminded him who had committed the felony. We didn't ask for triple the market value, as in some dramatic movie script. We aimed for something realistic but punitive enough to make the point. The settlement we reached was this. My parents would pay off the small remaining original mortgage on the bungalow, the one they'd co-signed, but I'd paid, effectively gifting me their share of that initial loan. They would also pay me a sum of $150,000 in damages for emotional distress, for the attempted fraudulent sale, for legal fees, and for the disruption to my life and business. This was a substantial amount for them, likely requiring them to liquidate significant savings or take a large personal loan. a bitter pill for people who valued financial appearances. But the most significant part of the settlement, for me, wasn't just financial. I insisted on a formal, written apology, acknowledged and signed by both of them, detailing their actions and expressing remorse. And I insisted that they, along with Chloe, attend at least 3 sessions of family counseling with a therapist of my choosing. Should I ever decide I wanted to attempt to rebuild any semblance of a relationship, the latter was more for Chloe's potential benefit than theirs. They agreed to everything, their desperation palpable. The threat of criminal charges hung heavy in the room, a sword of Damocles that David wielded with quiet precision. After the mediation, my mother tried to approach me, her face etched with a pleading look. "Sarah, please, can we just—" "No." "Mom," I said, my voice firm but weary. "Not now. Maybe not ever. You have the terms." I turned and walked away, the signed settlement agreement feeling like a heavy, hollow victory in my briefcase. The win was there, on paper. My bungalow was secure. I had a significant sum of money that would allow me to clear all debts, reinvest in my business, and even consider a fresh start elsewhere if I chose. The law had worked. My secret weapon, David's astute legal protection and the ugliness of their own criminal actions, had given me the power. But the emotional cost was immense. The family I knew, however flawed, was shattered. The first surprise, the forgery, had shown me the depths of their betrayal. The second surprise, Bradley's manipulation and Chloe's vulnerability, had painted a picture not of simple greed, but of pathetic desperation and a different kind of victimhood within my own family. I looked back on the fight. I had won, decisively. My parents were humbled, their reputation within their own minds, and potentially within their community, if this ever got out fully, was in tatters. Chloe's wedding, if it still happened, would be a far cry from the lavish affair Bradley had envisioned. I didn't feel the elation I thought I would. Instead, there was a profound sadness, an aching void where my family used to be. I hadn't set out for vengeance in the traditional sense of ruining them publicly. Though the threat was my leverage, I had wanted justice, and I had achieved it. But justice, I learned, could be a lonely companion. I didn't press criminal charges. The signed apology, the financial settlement, and the look of utter defeat in their eyes felt like enough. Perhaps it was a weakness, a lingering thread of filial duty, or perhaps it was a strategic decision, knowing that their suffering would be its own kind of prison. The future stretched before me, an open road. The money from the settlement gave me options I hadn't had before. I decided to sell the Portland bungalow. Despite the victory, it was tainted now, the memories too painful. I put it on the market on my own terms, with my own realtor, and it sold quickly. With the proceeds and the settlement, I made a bold move. I relocated to Denver, Colorado, a city I'd always loved for its blend of urban energy and outdoor access. I found a small studio space for my design business in a vibrant arts district and a charming little townhouse with a mountain view. A new city, a new life. The ties with my parents remained severed. My mother tried calling a few times, her voicemails filled with halting apologies and pleas to talk. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never would be. Chloe did call, a few months later. Her voice was small, hesitant. The lavish wedding to Bradley hadn't happened. His true colors, apparently, had become too glaring to ignore once the money dried up. She was living back with my parents, working a retail job, and sounded humbled. She asked if I would consider talking to her. Really talking. I told her I'd think about it. The path to any kind of reconciliation, even with her, would be long and uncertain. Sometimes, standing on my new balcony, looking out at the majestic Rockies, I thought about that one phone call from Maria, the neighbor whose concern had set everything in motion, and then the subsequent calls, to David, to my parents, the calls that unraveled deceit and delivered a harsh, necessary justice. It wasn't one single call that made them drop to their knees in a literal sense, but the cumulative weight of their actions, exposed by my refusal to be a silent victim, had brought them to a point of profound reckoning. I was starting over, stronger, wiser, and a little more scarred. But as the Colorado sun warmed my face, I knew I had looked back for the last time. My future was my own, bought and paid for by a fight I never asked for, but one I was proud to have won.